Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Boa tarde, todas e todos. So, welcome everyone to our session today of the STS Colloquium, our fourth session of the second STS Colloquium on Science, Technology, and Society. Today we have the honor and the privilege to have two very important thinkers on responsible innovation. So our topic today is responsible innovation and sustainability. And we have Phil McNaughton and Vincent Block here with us. I thank you both for taking the time to be here with us today. This is an initiative of many graduate programs in Brazil, Portugal, and we have a broad Latin American audience. So it's very interesting, very rich, very satisfying that Phil will go first, and then Vincent Block will go second. We'll do a half hour for Phil, a half hour for Vincent, then we're opening up the debate. And so, welcome. And Phil McNaughton, for those of you not familiar with his work, he's one of the more relevant, more prominent thinkers of responsible innovation. He's been to Brazil. He knows Brazil deeply and worked with Latin American scholars. He's a professor in the Knowledge, Technology, and Innovation group at Wagner University. He's an interdisciplinary social scientist working at the interface of science and technology studies, public engagement studies, governance of emerging technology, and responsible innovation. Over 30 and over 40 contributions to edited collections. So he's very prolific, very productive, very present in current debates on responsible innovation. He's done many interesting empirical comparative work projects on responsible innovation and governance of technology. He's going to mention some of these today, I hope. And yeah, I welcome Phil. I've worked with him many times. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. And without further ado, Phil, you have the floor.
Marco, so much for that very generous and kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to interact with you. And I'd like to thank Tiago very much for this kind invitation. It's an honor to talk to this colloquium. It's particularly interesting to think about responsible innovation in a Latin American context and what this might mean and how to think about that. So I'm delighted to do this. So Marco, can I make sure my slides are working? Okay, great, there we are. Okay,
Yep,
great.
they look good. Working.
Fantastic, excellent. So what I want to do in this talk is, and it's also a great pleasure to talk to, to all these graduate programs. So I'm really interested in the dialogue we have afterwards. And I'm also interested to have a dialogue with my very good friend and colleague, Vincent Block. So I look forward to that interaction as well. Okay, so what I want to talk about is a few things. So I wanted to try to contextualize responsible innovation as a model of how we think about responsibility in science. Then to talk a little bit about what is responsible innovation, to look at one framework that I've been involved with, and lastly to think about, well, what might this mean in the context of Latin America and more generally in the global South, and to introduce a particular case, the case of GM crops. Okay, so this is how I think about it, at least, and it's just one conceptualization. And what the way I want to think about it is that there are three sort of ways of thinking about what responsibility in science is constituted. So one is what I call responsibility 1.0. So this is really the idea to to do science with integrity. And this is the standard way of thinking about responsibility in science. And it's still incredibly important to make sure that we produce reliable, possibly reproducible knowledge, and to make sure we have particular sort of values or virtues that upholds, the practice of science. So, and these kind of Miltonian norms is one way of thinking about them. And this model typically is an internalist model. It doesn't really think much about what science does. It's all about how science is practiced. So this is one in which, society is rather removed from science and technology. So there's no sort of form of interaction to any great extent. They're public science, as it were. And if you get a PhD in the Netherlands, you have to sign a code of conduct, and these are really the sort of values and virtues that are meant to uphold scientific integrity. So you promise to be honest, scrupulous, transparent, independent, and responsible. Now, of course, you might do this, well. You might produce good science, solid science, sound science. But just because you do that does not mitigate that the science that you produce might have some, negative or controversial kind of impacts. And and of course, there's a politics to all of this as well. I know in Brazil, there's a lot of an appeal to scientific integrity and autonomy, really in the context of corruption and lots of other things. So this leads to what we call responsibility 2.0, which is one in which you think about doing science and technology not just to produce good science, but for society. So science for society. And this is what's often thought about in terms of, goal-oriented or mission-oriented science. So science that responds to the important issues of today and tomorrow, or which responds in the context of this talk about sustainability, the science that responds to, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. And, this is all well and good, but just because you do science for society doesn't necessarily mean that the societal outcomes are going to be unproblematically positive. And one reason for this is that a lot of the challenges we face are what we term wicked problems. So by this, we mean that these are issues that are difficult or impossible to solve, that can be legitimately defined in different ways, where stakeholders can have very radically different worldviews, different frames for understanding the problem, with no precedent nor a clear solution or goal state, and where every problem can be a symptom of another problem. So this creates lots of complications as to what it means to do science for society. So for which stakeholders, for which framing. And so this really is one context in which responsible innovation has developed. It means we do science not just for society, but what we term science with and for society. So the issue here is really one of alignment. So how can you align science and technology with and for society? So this is some context to some work which we did with people like Jack Stilgo and Richard Owen, both of whom actually came to Brazil in 2014. We had a wonderful workshop there on responsible innovation and what it might mean in the Brazilian context. But this was some earlier research in which we looked at, well, what is responsible innovation? What is different about it? Why is it important? Why now? And what does this mean for funding bodies and for research institutions more generally. So firstly, there's a question of definition. So this was taken forward a lot by the European Commission, and their definition in 2013 was, well, what is it? Well, it's a way to open up research and innovation activities to allow all societal actors to work together during the whole research and innovation process in order to align both the process and its outcomes with the values, needs, and expectations of European society. Okay, so that's one definition. So how we can involve societal actors at different stages. So we had a kind of a pithier definition. We suggested it's, well, we take care of the future through collective stewardship of science and innovation in the present. So the question that we had to grapple with is, well, how do you build a framework for responsible innovation governance? And the first challenge was, well, it's very difficult to think about how to govern science and technology, because when you develop a technology and when it's young enough that you can influence it, you often don't know where it's going to lead, what the social impacts will look like. But often when it's mature enough that you have a good idea of its consequences, it's too late to change it. It's locked in. So this was the David Collingridge, his control dilemma. And how you grapple with this? Well, we thought it's quite interesting to think about responsibility along 4 constituent dimensions. So not just to think about being responsible by being accountable or being liable, sort of retrospective ways of thinking about responsibility, but also to think about it in terms of how you might care for it as it folds into the future, and how you might be responsive to science and technology and innovation more generally, as you gain a sense in the iterative ideas as to what it can and it's likely to do. So we said that we should reconfigure responsibility from a retrospective to a prospective way, to think of it as a collective way, and to think about role responsibilities, particularly for science and scientists, in ways that, in which embraces how a particular bit of science innovation is going to fold into the future. So the second challenge is to think about, well, how can we direct science? So how can we direct science so it produces the right kinds of impacts? And one way which we thought it'd be helpful is to say, well, let's think about what is it that concerns stakeholders, citizens, publics about science and innovation. What are the kinds of questions that people would like to see scientists ask of themselves? So we did a kind of a meta analysis, and we found out that there are 5 kind of broad sort of themes, really, that articulate a lot of public concerns. So people ask, well, why are you doing science innovation? What's the purpose of it? Is it a good purpose? Is it in the public interest or just the private interest? So that's one set of questions. Another set of questions was to do with trust. So do you trust science? Do you trust the governance of science? Do you trust the institutions that oversee science? So those second set of questions. A third set of questions was, well, do you feel included? Do you feel that you're part of the process that's helping determine what science gets done and for whom and what kinds of questions get asked? The fourth one was about speed and direction. So is it going at the right kind of speed and the right kind of direction? And the last one was to do with ethics and trade-offs. So who's going to get the benefits and who's going to, bear the risks, as it were. So we suggested that if we want to think about responsibility in ways that are aligned with public concerns, then we need to ask different kinds of questions and embed that into the practice of doing science. So what are the likely risks and benefits? How will they be distributed? What are the impacts can we anticipate? How might these change? What don't we know about? What might we never know about? And process questions and purpose questions. And the point of this was to say, well, our vision at least was that these kinds of questions should be at least part of the practice of doing good and responsible science. So this then, we distilled this into what we termed the AIR framework, in which we said for innovation, science innovation, to be responsible, we should develop capacities aimed at better anticipation of impacts. Okay, we should develop capacities aimed at including a wide range of stakeholders at different stages of science innovation. We should develop capacities aimed at engendering reflexivity, so that we might be reflexive of our own values and to be aware that these might not necessarily be shared, and that we should be responsive to these other dimensions. So this is what we term the AIR framework. And we came across, well, we articulated what this might look like and what might be some indicative techniques and approaches that might help foster this for inclusion, anticipation, inclusion, reflexivity, and responsiveness. And this was adopted by one of the research councils in the UK, which we were very pleased about. And it became part of the training. So if you do a PhD in the physical sciences and engineering in the UK, you now trained in doing responsible innovation. And it's been taken up by various research councils in different ways, but in ways which are to some extent informed by this kind of framework. So what I want to finish with now, or to say a little bit about, is some work which we did, and Vincent was part of the project. It was a lovely project in which we asked the question, well, what might it look like for responsible innovation to travel? So we were interested not just in thinking about this in a European context, but thinking about this in a wider sort of global context as well. So we had European partners, but we also had partners in Brazil, and Marco and Luis were very much active in this role, also in the United States and Australia, but also in India and China. And what we suggested was that we shouldn't just think of this as a process of translation, but what Tess Tisama articulated in a really nice way, building on, formative ideas coming out of actually Marco's department, is we should think of this not just in terms of translation, but also as transduction. So we should think about this not as a European export, but as a way of opening up the concept for iterative meaning making, in which RI can be contextually negotiated and reconfigured. So, and this was very interesting in work which we did both in terms of a university, University of Campinas, Unicamp, but also in terms of a research council, research funding body, FAPESP. And these activities are still going on at the moment. So, well, what I want to conclude with is, well, let's think about what this might mean in particular cases, and also some work which we did around this time was to think about, well, what might it look like to grow an inclusive and democratic debate in a strategic societal issue? And the issue that we focused on was GM crops, genetically modified crops in the global south. So, and this is a really, really interesting issue because GM crops are incredibly contested. They're contested not just in the UK and Europe, but across much of the global south. And at the same time, a lot of the growth of GM crops in terms of staples, in particular in terms of soy and corn, maize and cotton and other ones, are actually a lot of the growth is happening in the global south, but they still remain incredibly contested. So we thought this was a very interesting site to think about, well, what would an inclusive democratic societal debate on an issue look like? Not least because a lot of the scholarship on GM crops has taken place in the global north. So what might it look? And of course, there's a lot of contestation, but to further that conversation a little bit, we thought would be interesting. And as all of you know, this has been an issue that's been hugely contested in Brazil, in India, and Mexico in particular. So we did research with academic groups in Brazil and Mexico and India. So in Brazil, it was with Julia Givon's group in Florianopolis, and other groups in Mexico and India in relation to 3 different crops: GM maize in Mexico, GM soya in Brazil, and GM cotton in India. So for the methodology, well, we worked with local partners. We had a review of the debate in each country to contextualize the debate. We then did a 9-week ethnography with farmers and other actors in a rural setting. We had a set of interviews and questionnaires with different stakeholders. We held focus group discussions with mostly urban citizens and consumers. We employed a participant observation study in a public or non-profit national research laboratory involved with the development of GM crops. And then we had a deliberative workshop with stakeholders, so asking how to advance the debate on GM crops. And so the debate really was to say, well, if we are to govern GM crops in a socially robust and inclusive democratic way, we need to engage with the issue within the terms of the debate as it is considered by an inclusive array of actors, including publics and farmers. And well, what do we find? Well, we find lots of really interesting stuff, and we wrote a nice book about it. But what we found was that if we look at the regulatory agencies involved in regulating GM crops, that the perceived authority of them was generally quite low across these 3 jurisdictions. So that was really interesting. We also found the degree of public engagement, the degree of sustained effort by institutional actors to engage the public across the 3 jurisdictions was also low. So that was interesting. And partly a result of both of those, there was really very, very intense protest movements. And what was interesting was how GM acted as a symbol, really, of a wider struggle, whether it's against neoliberalism, NAFTA, anti-globalization, struggle against multinationals. And the other final thing we found was that, the debate depended to some extent on the cultural resonance of the crop. Now, in Mexico, corn or maize is incredibly resonant. It really is an integral part of Mexican identity, history, and culture. In Brazil, soy isn't. Nobody really knows what a soy plant looks like. It's got very little cultural significance in Brazil. In cotton, it has quite a high resonance, but in a different kind of way. So there were lots of factors helping understand why the issue had become an issue in these three different countries, why it had become controversial, an active kind of symbol. And what was interesting, really, in that while there was a huge, cultural significance of this issue, there was very little capacity to engage with these sort of wider cultural, geopolitical sort of issues within the terms of the debate of regulation, which really centered around questions of demonstrable risk. So all these other issues got funneled down into questions of risk, and these regulatory bodies like CT and Bio became really horrible sort of places because there was no other space to negotiate, to deliberate, these incredibly important issues. So there was a lack of authoritative governance. There's a challenge of how to govern beyond risk. And in relation to that, there's what Martin Heyer, another very nice, good, Dutch academic, he calls an institutional void. And here we suggest this one sort of set of possibilities, opportunities in which responsible innovation can make a difference. So we thought this is a perfect example of how we can anticipate, the sort of social, political, cultural impacts of this particular kind of innovation, where we can have inclusive debates, where we can breed reflexivity amongst both scientific and institutional and regulatory actors, leading to a more responsive sort of system. Okay, so this is broadly what I wanted to say is an example of how we might move from translation to transduction, and how responsive innovation could be seen to open up debates, hopefully in profitable ways. So I think that's my 30 minutes done. So I'd like to thank you so much for listening. I think I'll now pass it back to Marco and to Vincent, and I look forward very much to talking with you in a conversation afterwards.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was perfect timing. You still had some 5 minutes, so we can use that for the debate. So now I would like to Dr. Vincent Block. Thank you so much again for participating in this and debating with us. Dr. Vincent Block is associate professor in philosophy of technology and responsible innovation at the philosophy chair group, Wageningen University in Holland. He's held various management positions in the healthcare sector. He became, in 2006, director of the Louis Bolk Institute. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it right. An international research institute in the field of organic sustainable agriculture, nutrition, and healthcare. In 2005, he received his PhD in philosophy at Leiden. He has several books discussing philosophy of technology, and also collaborates with Phil and other very prominent intellectuals thinking responsible innovation in Europe. So again, this is opportune moment to engage with dialogue with Latin American scholars, Portuguese, Spanish-speaking scholars that are worried and concerned and interested in engaging with ROI and sustainability studies. So thank you. Floor is yours, Dr. Block.
Thank you, Marco, and also thank you, Tiago, for inviting me. And I'm very happy that I am able to talk to you today. Tiago, I assume that you will put my screen on, my slides. Yeah, great. And I'm very happy also that Phil, who is really one of the main figures in the responsible innovation debate, was presenting before me. And in my preparation, I already assumed a little bit that Phil would concentrate on responsible innovation as a concept. So what I would like to do today is to zoom out a little bit. So Phil presented on the concept of responsible innovation and its application, for instance, in GM crops. And I would like to zoom out a little bit to the, let's say, the transition towards sustainability that our society is aiming for. And that's why I framed my presentation in terms of towards a responsible, circular, bio-based economy, not focusing only on innovation, but the societal transition towards circularity, contrary to a linear economy, and a bio-based economy, contrary to a fossil fuel-based economy. So current developments in sustainable product development are promising and can be seen as the motor behind the transformation to the circular bio-based economy. And at the same time, this transition didn't take place yet. Recent studies indicate that such a transition is promising, although the actual practice is still marginal. And if companies, for instance, economic actors, engage with circularity or bio-based, it is often still a side event and not part of the core business. In the sustainability literature, this is depicted in the following way. We are currently between what is called pre-development, so small changes in the system, but not yet visible, and the take-off phase, in which structural changes gain momentum. This is just the example of the Netherlands, but I think it's safe to say that we can see comparable pictures in other parts of the world. Currently, especially in the European context, because I'm living here, I'm living in the European context, huge investments at policy level are there to enter the next phase and to establish this transformation to the bio-based economy. Normally, the explanation why the transition isn't achieved yet is found in the complexity of this transition. The idea is that the transformation to sustainable development is a complex process, Phil already mentioned, a wicked problem, and result of co-evolution of economic, technological, institutional, cultural developments at multiple levels and along different timescales. This is often depicted in the following way. The idea is that the transformation to the bio-based or circular economy evolves when developments at three levels align. At the micro level, so the level of new technology and innovation, it concerns innovation practices and developments. At the meso level, at the middle, you see current institutional arrangements, dominant practices and regulation, for instance. And then the highest level, this macro level, you see long-term trends and events that put pressure on the regime. At the micro level, is, for instance, seen as important to provide room for frontrunners to promote radical innovations. And at the regime level, for instance, we can identify vested interests as a barrier to this transition, like the fossil fuel industry, like Shell in the Netherlands. They buy patents of sustainable technologies, for instance, but do not necessarily exploit them, but leave them on the shelf in order to safeguard their market position. I want to make 3 claims, or I want to reflect a little bit together with you on 3 claims that we can then discuss during the discussion. The first claim is that current innovations for circular and bio-based economy are framed within the market or economic logic and miss the normative aspects of sustainable development. And I will argue that the transformation to sustainable development requires a fundamental reflection on the role of economic actors in society and in the environment. The second claim I would like to share with you, and that I will develop a little bit in this paper, is that normative and socio-economic aspects are missed in current research and debates in the circular and bio-based economy. And that these, let's say, socio-ethical barriers can be seen as the main barrier to the transformation or transition to sustainability. And the third claim is that responsible innovation can help to address this normative and socio-economic issues in this transition, and therefore can be seen as a main driver towards sustainable development. So let's first look at the first claim. What explains the barrier to the transformation to sustainable business practice, for instance? In this multi-level perspective, there is a strong focus on technological challenges and on policy and regulatory drivers and barriers for this transformation. What is often missed is the normative and socio-economic barrier to this transformation to the circular or bio-based economy. I don't want to deny that issues like policy and technology are important, but I would like to focus on these normative aspects. In current research on sustainable innovations, for instance, there's a strong focus on what can be called the economic fix in sustainable innovation. The main question is, how can we technologically and economically valorize biomass, for instance, or can make recyclable products in a sustainable way. In the Netherlands, for instance, where I live, the bio-based economy is largely determined by biomass as a source of renewable energy, and not yet by higher level specialized bioproducts like biomedicine. The focus on biofuels doesn't necessarily lead to sustainable development, but to a greening of coal-fired power plants, as some of my colleagues argue. This is comparable with findings in the circular economy literature, which indicate that the innovation trajectories are largely determined by recycling and not by sharing, reusing, and repairing. That is, potential more sustainable practices. The concept of logics can explain how values impact the issues that are seen as important to address in innovation. In current sustainable innovation practices, it is the economic or market logic that explains why companies in the bio-based or circular economy currently focus on these profits, efficiency, and operational effectiveness. The economic or market logic is appealing to circular economy as it holds the promise that it can continue business as usual. So the idea is that renewable resources plus business as usual constitutes a circular bio-based economy. Now, of course, technical feasibility, economic feasibility is important in life, but is it sufficient to make the transformation to sustainable society possible? In first instance, sustainable development is a normative concept. It doesn't describe the world as it is, but the world as it should be. Compare it, for instance, with child labor or food safety. These are not questions of efficiency and optimization, but normative standards of what to do and what not to do in innovation practice. In the concept of circular or bio-based economy, also a normative standard is at stake. And we talk about bio-based or circular economy, which means an economy that relies on renewable natural resources. But in practice, the renewability of natural resources is not taken as such a normative standard for innovation, but as a guideline for optimization. Now compare this with the idea, compare it with the idea that we should only try to avoid child labor or try to guarantee food safety. That wouldn't be acceptable. So in current practices of sustainable innovation, sustainability is not taken as such a normative standard. On the contrary, the environment is seen as a subset of the human economy, that is, as a resource for production. And in this conceptualization, natural capital is seen as interchangeable with and replaceable by human-made capital. But the question is bio-based economy just a new way of doing business as usual, in which biomass is seen as a source of added value for economic returns? Or is its ambition to establish a new or different economy, one that operates within the carrying capacity of the biophysical system of planet Earth? To give you an impression of what such a circular economy within the carrying capacity of planet Earth would look like, we turn to the model of, I show you a picture of the model of Rockström. I guess you are familiar with these type of pictures at least. Rockström operationalized the biosphere in terms of 9 planetary systems. Green shading represents safe operating space. Red shading or orange, orange towards red, shading represents the current performance. The model enables to evaluate and compare performance of bio-based or circular business practices with non-bio-based practices. It shows areas where new product development and innovation has to be avoided and where space is for further development. And I mentioned this example in particular because, and it was really strange, I'm not sure whether how it is in Brazil, but yesterday it was in the news that also one of these 9 dimensions, water, is now turned into red, into a red area. It was very strange that this was announced yesterday or the day before, but the Dutch newspapers didn't publish on this, which is, in my view, rather strange. What it shows is that it provides this type of planetary boundaries, provides a model of biophysical boundaries for any development in sustainable innovation towards a sustainable society. This model of biophysical boundaries can be depicted also in the following way. Business or innovation, private innovation in business, societal and biospheric systems are nested systems in which business is seen as dependent on society and in the end on the biosphere. The biosphere as planetary boundary affects business activities in a normative way. And this requires that economic actors engaged in sustainable innovation operate within this carrying capacity of the biosphere. So to sum up, what I've tried to show so far, current practices in the circular bioeconomy are framed within the market or economic logic and miss the normative aspects of sustainable development. I would argue that a real circularity or real sustainability requires fundamental reflections on the role of economics in society and in the environment, with significant consequences for what can be achieved and what can be done in innovation practice. Circular bio-based economy cannot be understood as a renewable energy practice plus a business as usual. It requires an economic activity of innovation, sustainable innovation, within the carrying capacity of the biophysical system of planet Earth. So the second claim that I wanted to reflect upon together with you is that the normative and other socio-economic aspects are missed by current bio-based and circular practices. This can be seen as one of the main barriers to this transition towards sustainability. Based on a long-term analysis, Verbong and Gil in 2007, for instance, already argued that we cannot expect transitions to a new bio-based energy system to take place easily because currently they are not driven by environmental concerns. This means a lack of consumer concern and or a lack of consumer demand for such sustainable practices. And this lack corresponds with a lack of the social dimension in the supply of bio-based and circular products and services. Now, what are issues in these social dimensions in sustainability transitions leading to bio-based or circular economy? What is often mentioned is the role of technology, and then especially digital technology. The increase of technology drive the circular economy practice. And for instance, to give the example of the agricultural sector, the application of digitalization, artificial intelligence, etc., provides huge opportunities for sustainability, but also raise all kinds of societal concerns. For instance, very generally speaking, about the industrialization of the agricultural sector. And in Europe, we talk about megastalls. You can talk about horizon pollution, stench and noise disturbance. But also, if you talk about artificial intelligence and digitalization, about the huge impact of all these type of technologies on ownership, privacy, control of data, power structures, etc., etc. On the one hand, societal resistance is fueled because the high expectations regarding new technology are often not redeemed. On the other hand, we can say that the more radical an innovation, like life science technologies for bioeconomy, the more it will raise societal questions, and the more responsibility of actors is required. So to conclude regarding my second claim, the normative and social economic aspects are often missed in current efforts of sustainable innovations towards circular and bio-based economy. This may cause societal resistance against circular bioeconomy, and especially if their amount increases, like what we see nowadays. As such, the lack of the acknowledgement of this normative and socio-economic issues can be seen as one of the main barriers to the transition towards sustainability. This transformation requires an extension of the economic and market logic with a social logic or social ethical logic in order to safeguard the public good, and not only technological feasibility and economic profit. Currently, little research is on how a social logic can be implemented in the bio-based circular economy, how the economic and social align or conflict, and how multiple actors in the bio-based economy collaborate to address socio-economic issues collectively. It's very just anecdotal. On a yearly basis, I I attend conferences on circular economy or bio-based economy, and nobody is talking about these type of normative issues. It's always mainly about the technical and the business issues. Now, one way to substantiate the idea of a social ethical logic is the concept of responsible innovation. And I leave the explanation of responsible innovation because I think that Phil did a great job by introducing that topic. So keep that in mind as the frame of responsibility and responsible innovation that I have in mind here as well. Responsible innovation provides a sort of systematic method for the identification, evaluation, and management of ethical and social issues within technological developments in order to achieve ethical, acceptable, societal, desirable, and sustainable outcomes. Let's look at responsible innovation and circular and bio-based economy from an integrative perspective. One could argue that both have a strong policy support and have received attention from both industry and policymakers. Also, both tackle issues related to sustainable development through innovation. In the case of responsible innovation, democratization of innovation to tackle grand challenges of our time, including sustainable development. And in the case of circular bio-based economy, everything is about fostering a closed loop economy through new technologies and economic relationships for sustainability. So is it possible that both concepts, both practices, both developments can mutually reinforce each other? Now, as indicated, the circular economy tends to overlook these social dimensions of sustainability. And here, responsible innovation can provide an opportunity due to the democratic nature of responsible innovation. It is all about the inclusion of stakeholders representing society to put social issues on the agenda. So here you can see how responsible innovation can reinforce the efforts and the practice of circular and bio-based economy. Another issue in the circular bio-based economy is the oversimplistic goals and unintended consequences, which are often not taken into account. Also here, responsible innovation provides an opportunity because it provides a governance framework whereby wider considerations of the implications of innovation are included, and as a result, there's room for adjustment. So therefore, responsible innovation could further the role of the circular and bio-based economy in the system transition towards sustainability by providing the tools to incorporate the social logic and the necessary governance for a democratic, inclusive transition towards a sustainable development. On the other hand, responsible innovation can also benefit, I would argue, from the notion of the circular economy. Although there's an increasing amount of work on responsible innovation in the private sector, the conceptuality is mainly focusing on publicly funded research and innovation. And that is not a problem, but here you can imagine that the circular economy and the bio-based economy can be of help because it provides this market logic that is necessary to make this transition to a circular bio-based economy. So I come to a close. regarding the third claim that I wanted to elaborate on together with you. Because the integration of socio-economic issues in the bio-based economy are often missing, responsible innovation is proposed as a strategy to integrate socio-economic issues in the transition towards sustainability. In this way, responsible innovation can substantiate the social logic which is claimed to be prerequisite for the transformation to a sustainable economy. In this respect, responsible innovation can be seen as a driver of such a transition. And I hope with this that we can have a discussion together about the role of sustainability in responsible innovation, and also in discussion with you guys out there in Brazil and in the other parts of the world. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I want to thank my team, because such a presentation I make, of course, together with my colleagues, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. These are both very exciting, rich, instigating talks. Even though I've heard Phil speak many times, I'm always instigated by his analysis. So we already have some questions. Before that, I'll just make a few comments to also put my perceptions on this. And these are for both of you, not specifically for one or the other. I mean, regarding Phil's talk, I really like the way you divide the responsibility 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and the idea of transduction that emerged out of the RI Practice project is interesting. I don't think people realize that there was a rich dialogue between Latin American STS and RI in this project, and the article by Tess Dozema on transduction was one of the more interesting outcomes, and I'm glad you picked it up as well. But it speaks to the difficulty of travel, how these things travel, which is one issue we can always talk about in terms of RRI and sustainability, as a more general problem, how to make things travel. Transduction is an interesting way to think of adaptation, engaging with locally in a situated way with more global concepts of governance. But I'm wondering about what we found in Brazil when we talk about autonomy, the value of autonomy for Brazilian scientists and experts, and the difficult time that we had engaging with them in dialogue. And some of it was regarding the protection that they thought they needed to engage with, how they needed to protect themselves from the public when they thought the public was anti-science. This was 2016, way before the current political situation. I think we saw things back there, the more negative aspects of the anti-science things that we were mentioning came about, unfortunately. So in context, so my comment is, in these contexts where engaging with the public doesn't necessarily protect science or foment science. And I saw this in another project when I was talking about sustainability with a group in Mato Grosso, northern Mato Grosso, in the Amazon, where soya is planted. I was in the places where the Amazon is fully deforested, and soy and gold mining and all those things are happening. People think about sustainability in vastly different ways than we were thinking about them. So when we engage locally, maybe they want the gold mining to go on. They want the soy. They don't want the forest. They don't want the bio-based economy. So engaging and aligning values needs to be also when we try to align sometimes, it becomes less sustainable, less amenable to, or less democratic even, thinking about Brazil, where people don't think that the public should be participating in some decisions, especially technical decisions. In terms of what, sorry for the long winding comment. In terms of what Vincent was saying, again, it's kind of close to what I've said before. But I wanted to make another comment, Vincent, about the circular economy. I'm co-authoring this paper on Norway's debate on circular economy, and a lot of the things resonate with what you're saying about the market logic, this market-centered logic that people have, where people believe that many people believe that just innovation practices will drive us towards sustainability, and people forget about the logics of politics, and which in the RI Practice project we looked at very closely, and we saw the so when we have the debate around circular bio-based economy be sometimes very materialistic in terms of um, um, a matter of circular kind of closed loop economy where we just look at molecules circulating, that kind of reductionist thinking, reductionist in terms of economic thinking, but also in terms of the physics of it. The dangers when we frame it that way, it becomes dangerously simplistic to implement governance practices. I'm remembering Phil's engagement with solar geoengineering projects. When we see climate change as a problem of carbon management, things like geoengineering become feasible. And so this is a thing that we have to engage with. I'm very glad to the debate, because again, we've been like for decades saying we need more philosophy, social science, ethics, et cetera, and we still need to say those things. Unfortunately, even in Europe, in Latin America, or places where the debate is very much advanced. So these are some comments. I'm going to read some questions here, so we can have a bunch of things you can react to. So Tiago is asking a question. I'll read. Citizens are increasingly distrustful of institutions, expertise, and politics, even in Europe. Since its emergence in 2011, RI seems to have tried already to answer this general feeling by reforming our development model. What needs to be adjusted in RI for regaining momentum as a transformative framework for policy? And I'm reading up another question by Tiago. Actually, these are not by Tiago. These are that's one question, just one more. So we can go back to you guys. So another question is, with Vincent's speech, I implied that there was an ongoing dominant paradigm, i.e. the persistence of, for instance, of the techno-economic concept of innovation. Entrepreneurial bias of ultra-liberal ideology societies seems that to reach a paradigm change, to nurture a new development model, we need the convergence of several actors. What would be the role of epistemic communities and international organizations? Okay, so I'll leave you with those broad comments, and I think maybe Phil can go on and Vincent, or however you feel comfortable.
Yes. Thank you, Marco, and for your lovely reflections as ever. That was very, very nice. No, I completely agree that that is complicated, and that sort of inclusive engagement does not always align with easy sort of panaceas towards sustainability. But I would say really there is no alternative but to listen, and to listen very deeply. And any long-term vision of sustainability really has two alternatives. Either you think you can do it in a technocratic way and just impose it upon people. And I remember talking to, I think, even ministers in the Brazilian government who were saying, well, with GMOs, it's a complicated scientific issues, and the Brazilian public is not educated enough to think through the issues, and that of course is both bullshit, but also it's one that perpetuates the problem, as it were. So I think you can inculcate deliberative and inclusive processes, and often it's those processes which can lead to better debate. So at the moment, even in deforested soy areas, that's precisely where you need to have the debate. You need to engage. You need to deliberate. You need to think about values. You need to look at how science can be mobilized in ways, and sometimes decisions are not going to be straightforward or easy. But at least if you start with the idea that that we are listening, we are engaging, and institutions are somehow trying to respond to very complicated realities, albeit realities in which the value of sustainability is still a kind of an absolute norm, is kind of critical. So I would, the second bit really is to, well, what is the transformative vision of RI? And here I completely endorse, and I think Vincent, his articulation of the problem of innovation as being one of endorsing kind of market or commercial values, where responsible innovation sets out possibilities of different kinds of values, is absolutely critical. Now, I've been very, very inspired by another ex-member of the RI Practice project, which is Mario Pansera. And Mario's been written in very interesting ways, actually, about circular economies and responsible innovation. And his idea, and I think it's one worth thinking about critically, is perhaps we should think more critically about innovation as in the service of perpetual growth. So the idea of degrowth or post-growth, or thinking about what constitutes progress, societal progress in non-growth ways, becomes a really important and very lively debate that's going on, interestingly, much in Barcelona. I don't quite know why, but that seems to be a center for a lot of the activities of this in really interesting ways. But which brings me, I think, back to an engagement with Vincent's paper, which I think was really, I enjoyed all of it. And when Vincent talks about the need to engage with the normative and the sort of socio-political aspects in ways which the current framing of the economy doesn't. Well, I think that raises another sort of point of an opening for responsible innovation, which is how can we articulate a vision of the good life, of where we should be direct, of societal kind of direction. And I think that's where it could get really interesting. So how can we open our imagination of what Vincent called the societal logic, or a non-market-based sort of logic? So in terms of the circular economy, as Mario Pansera has said in a really nice paper, it's not so much how we produce, so to make sure it's circular. I mean, that's one aspect of it, but it's what we produce, and for for what purpose, and and how much we produce as well. So that raises sort of it opens up new normative questions as to how to rethink progress, societal sort of development, in a way which doesn't align with, sort of deterministic, simplistic, sort of economistic, market-based kind of logics, and how to import those sort of questions back into the debate around the circular economy. So I think that's what I would like to say in a way that addresses both of those questions.
Shall I try to build on what Phil has been saying? So thank you also, Mario, for these reflections, and also for kicking off the discussion, Phil. Maybe we also have to be a little bit critical towards ourselves, because responsible innovation, at least in the European context, was a topic which is heavily funded over the past decade. And that was the same decade in which populism arose, also in Europe. So in a way, I also think that we should be a little bit more critical, or let's talk about myself. I have to become also a little bit more critical about my own role as a social scientist in the way my team is contributing to what we call responsible innovation. But we are also incentivized by all kinds of funding that, for instance, limit ourselves to raise the real critical questions. And to give you just a personal example, we receive funding for AI research, artificial intelligence research in the agricultural sector. But the elephant in the room is, of course, the question, do we need AI? Do we need these type of digital technologies? Now, I cannot, to be honest, I cannot fully address this question, because the condition for the funding of my research with my PhDs and postdocs is partly due to the fact that that I do ethics of AI, ethics of digital technologies. So, of course, we are not, it's not only our fault, but I think it is reasonable to be also a little bit critical about ourselves. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Then the second thing maybe that is also important to mention is that because we tend now to all agree that to blame the market logic and to argue for a social or societal logic, as I try to do, but at the same time we have to be aware that we are living, as at least I'm not sure how it is in Brazil, but in Europe, we are also living in a society where there is a lack of consumer demand for circular economic practices. So people don't mind to buy sustainable, organic, fancy stuff, but as soon as they have to engage in refurbish or repair or reuse of materials in order to serve circular practices, they become reluctant to engage. So it is not only about the bad capitalists or the businesses that are only working on the that we can blame for what is happening nowadays, but we also have to become critical with regard to the role of consumers or citizens. And the third thing that I also wanted to make, maybe also a little bit to defend these businesses, if you take Phil's presentation, in which he argues that sustainable development is a wicked problem, so that means a highly complex problem with no solution even, and in which are many different activities are interdependent. I also think that we cannot solve a wicked problem without taking private sector into account. And what so I also think that in a way we have to engage the private sector because they should be part of the solution. They are now currently part of the problem, so to speak, but we cannot say, okay, let's get rid of the economic actors and let's do it in a different way. Maybe these are a first round of reflections based on the brilliant suggestion by you, Marco, and Phil. Thank you for that.
Thank you. So I'll go on to further questions here from Eduardo. To Professor Block, what might be the impact from the war in Ukraine to the transformation to a sustainable economy in Europe? Great question. Do you think it will be a barrier or an opportunity to do more innovation? Should I read?
Sorry.
Okay.
Maybe Phil wants to say something about the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I'd love to say something about the war in Ukraine, because I think it's, what's fascinating is, like sustainable development, it's not just a thing out there, it's not a technical thing, it's just not just a way, to be circular in a sort of physicalist sort of way. It's deeply social and moral. It's embedded, and I think what is fascinating about the Ukraine is, the way sustainable development is always contextualized in relation to other social and political issues, and I think what the Ukraine war has brought to bear, particularly in European context, is is a sort of it's an underpinning framing that we haven't really had for the last 40 years or so, which is around security and national determination and such like. So it provides a new sort of macro sort of socio-political context in which to think about innovation policy, actually, and this used to be quite significant really up until the 1970s, and and then we all became neoliberal and thought we didn't need to think about these sort of nationalistic concerns, and we all became global cosmopolitan liberal actors in which the market, and now we this is brought to bear that this is just an illusion. It's another sort of instant of this sort of neoliberal dream, seen as not quite as simple as people imagine it to be. So I think the context in which we now think about sustainability, but also from a national perspective. So we need to be careful about questions of of autonomy, of dependency, of lock-ins, of making choices in which we imagine the long-term ramifications. I mean, the whole notion of nuclear power is important. So nobody really thought that well, it wasn't actively thought about that when you construct nuclear power station, I bet in Ukraine they never thought the Russians might threaten their own nuclear power stations. Now, you could have thought that, if you'd open up that imagination, if you'd said, well, let's look at the geopolitical assumptions that underpin this decision to build a nuclear power plant, and let's think, let's imagine all the sort of worst possible scenarios and then think that through. And so that's kind of what response innovation is. That's what we mean is, what other impacts, can you imagine? Yeah. And what are the conditions to make them plausible? So, as Marco said with the geoengineering example, you create these radical technologies, they bring radical dilemmas into the world. And you have to think, well, it's almost impossible to govern the nuclear issue. So, if you have new, I don't know, AI or whatever else, digital, robotics, whatever else, so the radiation, what new sort of geopolitical issues might this present to the world, and how capable are our governance institutions to deal with that? What kind of society would we need to do this? So I think the Ukrainian war is incredibly, I mean, it's a real sort of eye opener that we really do need to open our imagination as to the potential ramifications of choices that we're making now and that we actually had made. And so I think it is a wake-up call in terms of, let's say, for sustainable development, for us, even from a national, local, whatever basis, to think, well, the idea of self-sufficiency, or the question about, being dependent on others and what that might mean for us, is very much brought to the fore in a very sort of direct political way. So, I mean, that's my thinking about this, at least.
Yeah, maybe to add to this, so I agree with what Phil said, but let's take it also in a positive way. You can argue that in the neoliberal world that we are living in, that the role of politics was reduced completely, as if there is only the sovereignty of the market and not the sovereignty of politics anymore. And what a crisis like in Ukraine shows is the rehabilitation of the political domain, you can argue. So there is a positive thing in the sense that we realize that there is a limit of the neoliberal way of thinking, and that we have to reconsider the balance between politics and economics, so to speak. Now, if we talk about the problem with the bio-based economy as dominated by market logic, you can welcome, of course, it is terrible what happens in Ukraine, but you can welcome this rehabilitation of the political domain, I would say. That's the first thing. The second thing that I want to add is that maybe you remember that in my presentation, I said that there was a sort of multi-level perspective of the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. Now, I would say that the war in Ukraine is typically something that emerges at the macro level. So at the highest level of the change or transitions at this level. And the idea is that, and that is also maybe possible, again, it's a terrible war, it should stop directly, but if you look at it from the perspective of system transitions, that especially dominant, that especially at this macro level changes can be a driver towards change. So in this regard, we already experienced that we have a problem with this war in Ukraine, that we have to reconsider our whole economy and our whole thinking about energy, and that provides at least opportunities for the transition towards a sustainable economic development. So in this regard, again, I repeat it because I don't want to be misunderstood. It's a terrible war, but indeed, I think that the war in Ukraine can also be part of the game that has to be changed.
That's very interesting, both of your comments. I remember when I look at Ukraine, I remember the 60s and 70s, the oil crisis of the 70s, and the role that is an example. Oh, sorry. The example of the ethanol car in Brazil was an example we discussed a lot when Phil was living in Campinas. And, very roughly, we had the macro issue of the prices of petroleum, but we had the local, regional, the national issue of the local elites who were engaged in planting sugarcane for centuries. And so the need that we can't just get resource availability or the prices of petroleum. We need to look at the situated aspects in each country so the possibilities of any transition depend on those situations. I think I'll read the last 3 questions that I have, and then we can go towards the end. So Eduardo asks, Has RI methodology already been proposed as a guideline or normative to the International Standardization Organization? I have a question by Tiago. He says, in the joint struggle for social and social environmental transformation, focus on the construction of new practices of a micro-sociological character. Could you comment on the possible relationships of tension and complementarity between these two perspectives?
I missed
I
that
can
one,
repeat that
Marco.
later
Could you
if you guys
just
need me to.
repeat that once more?
So in the joint struggle for social and social environmental transformations, there are actions that focus on the confrontation of macro social issues and projects that focus on the construction of new practices of a micro sociological character. Could you comment? So macro social issues versus micro sociological issues. Could you comment on the possible relationships of tension and complementarity between these two perspectives? And lastly, Eduardo, he's asking, in the mid-2000s, ex-President Lula has proposed to develop biofuel as a viable alternative to oil. He was criticized by ex-president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, that this would, many people made that critique, not just Hugo Chavez. Does this argument make sense? And those are the last questions that we have. I think that's all we have in terms of time as well. So Phil and then Vincent.
Yeah, sure, Michael. So, I mean, I first want to just say a little bit about the private sector, because, you know, to respond to what Vincent said earlier, and that, you know, I completely agree that that we need to involve the private sector. But it's fascinating because, you know, in a sense, you know, we've done quite a lot of research on the role of the private sector in the university. This is our university, Wageningen, although you could say this in a lot of other ones. And what we find is when the private sector comes to the university, there are obviously two things. You know, the university becomes a bit more private center focused, and the private sector becomes a little bit more university focused. So there's always that sort of dynamic, and there are tensions between the two. But what we see in terms of the sort of institutional way of thinking about the private sector is that this tends to be seen as essentially a social good. So the problem isn't, you know, the problem is the lack of a kind of a critical capacity to delineate what might be an appropriate role for the private sector in, let's say, a university. And I see exactly the same debate, let's say, in Brazil. So what might it mean to have a critical yet constructive role for the private sector in these debates? And I think that's a really important role for the STS community, to develop an imagination that could be sort of productive. So that's just one point. In terms of the point about you know, the tensions between kind of macro top-down approaches and micro bottom-up approaches, I think that's a really good and an important point. But and I think it's, you know, how do you negotiate both aspects? Sometimes the appropriate role is to be more critical from a fundamental structural perspective, and the other and other times it should be more generative in terms of developing kind of micro communities. And it's the relationship between the two that I think is important. There's a lot of good work on, you know, trying to theorize social innovations in relationship to that. Going back to the question about Lula and biofuels, I think, you know, the key issue is whether biofuels then fits into the sort of existing, you know, sort of structural, you know, economistic, you know, set of social relations, or whether biofuels can become part of something that's socially as well as economically different. And I think actually how you imagine that is a way of actually moving that debate forward a little bit. So I think I'll stop there and let Vincent have the final word.
Yeah, it's a bit strange that I present a whole paper in which I was critical about the market logic, and that now in the response to the question I start to defend the market logic. But okay, I will try to do my best. So regarding the first question about the macro level and the micro level, this is not really my field, but you can look at, for instance, in the transition literature to the role of niche management and the role of front runners, innovators in making the shift or making the transition happen, like a crisis at the macro level, like a war, can start the development of a transition. You can also argue, or is also a lot of research on how in niches, particular innovative practices can get the ball rolling, so to speak. But I have to admit that is not, you can find this literature all over the place. This is not... One thing about also in addition to what Phil was saying, so what is the dilemma of public and private actors? Let's assume that, to give you an example, we are working on a project on artificial photosynthesis, and our role is to think about responsible innovation in this area. And you can imagine that large companies are willing to collaborate with this research project because it's a fundamental research project on this area, because they want to buy or they want to file a patent. And we are reluctant to engage with private sector like Shell or large fossil fuel companies, because we want to take artificial photosynthesis to consider it also as a possibility to decentralize energy systems, for instance. But so that from our perspective, it is great to leave the large companies, for instance, out. At the same time, we as researchers will never bring a project or a result of our research to the market. So private sector actors are also very well able to translate responsible research or sustainable findings that or innovations, to bring them to the market in a way that is adding economic and ecological value. So that is also what I meant when I said that we cannot do it without the private sector, because we can talk and we can do a lot of research on responsible innovation with a huge amount of impacts foreseen, but it has to be translated at the level of the product that consumers buy. And companies, for instance, are much better able than we are, I would say, to make this translation from the results of the research in a product that adds value to the market and that find its ways to the market also. So that is something that I also think that we have to build upon. I think I leave it with this.
Thank you so much, Phil, Vincent, and everybody who participated. We had actually good numbers, about 55 at the peak, I think. So yeah, we did it. This was a very interesting debate. I have this could go on and on. I mean, if we need to talk about economic and neoliberal fundamentalism and relation to politics nowadays, as we are going through elections, but this maybe could go in another debate. Thank you so much. This was fantastic, and thank you everybody who was here. And yeah, so with this, I'll end the transmission. Thank you, and please continue to come to the colloquium.
Yep, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.